Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back to my channel. For those who's new, my name is Christian and this is my crazy plant life. In today's video, we are going to talk all about how to propagate your houseplants using a propagation box with sphagnum moss. This has become one of my favorite methods when it comes to propagating houseplants, and the reason being is because it does have a high success rate of getting your cuttings to root, grow new growth points, and then eventually turn into a beautiful houseplant. We're going to cover everything from the kind of box you can use for your propagation box, the type of sphagnum moss, how wet should your sphagnum moss be, when to water it, how often should you allow airflow, when to transfer the cuttings out of the prop box into their own little pot, and then we're going to do a tour of the different type of cuttings that's currently growing in my propagation box. I love propagation. There's a lot of reasons why people propagate houseplants. One, obviously to double up your plants if you want to make more, gift it to your friends or family. Another reason is to save a dying plant, which I've done in the past, especially during my early years in my plant journey. I have taken a lot of cuttings, and back then my favorite method of propagating houseplants was using the cutting and water propagation method, which is still kind of my go-to. It really does depend on the type of plant that I'm cutting or that I'm propagating, but lately it's been the propagation box, especially now that I am growing my own plants to obviously sell here at the shop. I do find that it is my favorite method when it comes to growing houseplants. So without further ado, we'll get started with the type of box you can use for your propagation box. Now, you can pretty much use any container as long as there's a lid that comes with it, and that lid can close tightly in order to trap the humidity. So I use everything from old takeout containers to Tupperwares like these that I get from the dollar store, or lately I've been using these like 4-liter bins that you see here. It's clear I got these at the dollar store for I think $4 a piece. Really works well. It's actually one of my favorite propagation box to use, especially when I'm either growing cuttings or I'm acclimating plants. I like to put them in here and just trap the humidity. One of the questions I often get when it comes to the prop box is, does it have to be clear or can I use something that's maybe colored? You can use a colored lid. For example, this is a blue one, as long as it's transparent or translucent, because you want to be able to not only allow light to kind of go through your propagation box, but also see the condensation that's taking place around the bin as well as on the lid. That's a great indication that your prop box is working, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But next thing is your sphagnum moss. So typically what I like to use is long strand, good quality sphagnum moss. Now this helps make sure that your cuttings will grow nicely, that they will not mold or rot. That's why I always recommend use good quality sphagnum moss. I use Best Grow, either the compressed one or this huge one right now, Super Moss, and this is great. Unfortunately, Amazon doesn't really sell this, so I can't link it in the description below, but I would suggest check out your local garden center or check online for like reptile stores that are probably local to you or within your state, country, and whatnot, and they can deliver because reptile stores, they do have sphagnum moss. So that's pretty much where I get mine. So make sure you are using really good quality sphagnum moss that are long strand. Now, the next thing you want to do when it comes to making a prop box is you want to lay a layer of wet sphagnum moss on the bottom of your prop box. The question I often get is, how wet should your sphagnum moss be when you put it in your prop box? My suggestion here is, when you're soaking your sphagnum moss like you see here, I like to wring out a lot of the excess water, and they will just kind of come out of the sphagnum moss. But you don't really want your sphagnum moss to be super soaking wet. You also don't want it to be too dry or damp. I like to just keep it in between wet, where you kind of see this nice golden brown color to it, and the water is still somewhat, dripping, not necessarily draining through like you see here. This is really wet, and you guys can even see that the sphagnum moss is quite dark. I don't like it when it's this wet. I usually typically like it when it's this nice kind of medium golden brown that you see here, and there are still some excess water that's kind of dripping lightly, not draining through. So that's typically my go-to when it comes to how wet should your sphagnum moss be. Okay, so what you want to do next is place a layer of wet sphagnum moss at the bottom of your prop box like you see here. I usually like to have mine at least about like an inch or an inch and a half of thickness of sphagnum moss at the bottom. That gives us enough room and space to, obviously maintain a lot of the moisture and water within the sphagnum moss. At the same time, allow those roots to kind of grow into the sphagnum moss. Okay, the key thing to do here is to make sure that you are not packing your sphagnum moss tightly to the bottom of that prop box. You want it to be slightly loose, so that way there is a bit of airflow within the sphagnum moss. So that will help allow the water to move through the sphagnum moss and not necessarily stay still, because that's pretty much what's going to cause a lot of your rotting or moldy, is when you have still water in a prop box that's not moving at all. So you want to make sure that your sphagnum moss is somewhat loose. Now, the next thing you want to do here is obviously place your cuttings. So when it comes to choosing your cuttings for your prop box, is make sure that your cuttings are nice and healthy and clean. Any fungus or disease that's on the cuttings will cause a lot of the rotting to happen. So you want to make sure they are healthy to begin with. I love throwing cuttings in here, everything from epiprenums like my Cebu Blue, Marble Queen, or even like my Neon, to a lot of philodendrons. I've thrown my Silver Sword in here, my Melanochrysum, my Verrucosum, my Philodendron Gigas, to even my Monstera Esqueleto, and even a few butterfly string of hearts. So a lot of things you can throw in here. The key thing is just making sure that there is a node in your cuttings, and when you are placing your cuttings in your prop box, making sure that that node is touching the sphagnum moss to really allow that root to kind of grow out of the aerial root or out of that node, and from there it will shoot out a new growth point. So that is what you want to do when it comes to your cuttings. After placing your cuttings, close your lid and make sure that you are placing this in an area that gets a lot of bright light, but more importantly, that is nice and warm temperatures. Is one of the key things that you need to do in order for your cuttings to really grow nicely in your prop box. If you don't have an area in your home that is warm enough for your prop box, what you can do is get yourself one of these heat mats that you see here that I'm using right now from Amazon. I'll link in the description below, but I use this quite often to either germinate my seeds or for my prop box, especially if I really want to speed up the process of them, trying to grow roots and then from there grow some growth points and whatnot. So great alternative if you don't have a warm enough space in your home. So the next stage here is to maintain your prop box, and the question I often get is how often should you open your lid and check in on your cuttings as well as allow airflow. So my rule of thumb is open your box at least once a day or once every other day for at least about like 2 to 3 minutes. It's a great opportunity for you to check on your cuttings, making sure that they are healthy, especially if your prop box is not showing any condensation either on the side of the box or on the lid. Like I said, condensation or those water droplets that you see around your box is a good indication that your prop box is working and that water is moving within that box. Because of that, sometimes I actually don't even open my box for like weeks, to be honest, because I know that it's working nicely there. And yeah, once in a while I'll check just to make sure that there's no rotting that's taking place in any of the cuttings. But that's what I would suggest for a lot of you people who's new to making prop box, is check in on it at least once a day, just for a couple of minutes, and that will allow you to obviously check in on your cuttings as well as allow some airflow. Now the next question is, how often should you water your prop box? Because there is a lot of moisture being trapped in the prop box and there's a lot of condensation around the box as well as on the lid, that pretty much recycles the water back into the sphagnum moss, if that makes sense. So sometimes I actually don't even have to water my prop box for like weeks or even months. So it really does depend. But if you are feeling that your sphagnum moss is starting to dry or starting to feel damp and you're not seeing as much condensation like you once were, then I would say that it's time to definitely give your sphagnum moss or prop box a good spray using like a sprayer bottle and whatnot. That will help dampen or wet your sphagnum moss again. If it is really too dry, just use your watering can and just lightly pour some water in your prop box to just get it to the same level as you once had it when you first created your wet sphagnum moss in your prop box. So that's how I go about watering my sphagnum moss if it is starting to dry out and whatnot. Now the next stage here is obviously when should you take out your cutting out of your prop box, when is it ready to move? The cool thing about using sphagnum moss in your prop box is it's a great potting medium to further develop the roots. So typically what I like to do when I'm noticing that my cuttings have grown nice, beautiful roots as well as a growth point. So for example, these Monstera siltepecana that you see here, these were all mid cuttings. I threw them in a prop box about maybe like a month and a half ago. They've grown quite a lot of new leaves and new growth point as well as beautiful roots. So the roots here are about like 2 inches long. From this point on, I would now start to remove some of these cuttings and start potting them in their own little container. However, I will still use sphagnum moss as my potting medium because it is a great potting medium to really further develop the roots, especially at the stage when you now have baby plants. So it is really easy to just transfer them out. You guys can see here, there are some moss attaching to the roots. I'll typically just leave that. Get a little container. You don't want to go too big because again, this is still a baby plant. The roots aren't that developed. Put a layer of sphagnum moss, put your cutting in there and then top it up with sphagnum moss. So that's typically when I would transfer my cuttings out of the prop box into their own little pot. Now, because these are still baby plants, what I usually like to do is actually keep these little babies in the prop box still to really speed up that development of the roots and further grow some new leaves. So that's typically what I'll do. If the prop box is too short and the plant is growing taller now, what I usually like to use then is one of these clear plastic bags that you see here. So I've done this on my Philodendron Verrucosum, my Gigas, my Melanochrysum, and even my Monstera Esqueleto that you see here. And this acts like a little humidity dome or a prop box, and you guys can see there's condensation taking place on the plastic bags. And I like to keep them in here for, until I really see those roots starting to show, probably, through the drainage holes, or they're really starting to like fill up that pot. And then from there, you can then kind of move it out of your prop box, maybe put it in a greenhouse, and even then, move it out of the sphagnum moss if you choose to use a different potting medium. So that's pretty much how I would go about, when to transfer your cuttings out of your prop box into their own little pot and containers. So that's pretty much how I go about making a prop box and growing new plants out of cuttings. And honestly, very, very easy to do. The question I often get is, how do you prevent mold from taking place? And really the key thing is making sure your prop box is in an area that is nice and warm, and you see that condensation taking place, because that means there's airflow, there's water movement within the box, and no standing still water, which is what causes a lot of the mold to take place in your prop box. So those are something to definitely keep in mind. So now let's do a little quick tour of what I'm growing currently in my prop box, so that way you guys have an idea on the different type of plants that you can grow in a prop box. So I'm gonna get behind the camera and we're gonna start this tour. All right guys, so in this propagation box, we have a lot of our monsteras. So for example, these are siltipicanas, and these are the ones that we transferred out of the prop box because they grew some roots and some new leaves, and we put them in their own little container in sphagnum moss still, and we are still keeping it in the prop box. But we got another baby one right here. And the one thing also I wanted to share with you guys is, when it comes to your cuttings, you want to make sure that you leave enough room on either side of the nodes. Like you see here, there's room right there, and there's room right there. And the reason being is because in the event that your cuttings do end up rotting or yellowing, it usually starts off at the inner nodes or on either side. And by the time it gets to the node, hopefully your node already shot some roots and it's already kind of taking off, where you don't really need this area, and you can easily cut that off. So that's why I always recommend leave a lot of space when it comes to your cuttings between the nodes or on either side of the nodes. But yeah, so these are siltipicanas, and these are the Stanleyana that I also cut from my mother plant. You guys can see there's an aerial root there that's already taking off, but this is also attached there. This is the mid cut, so there is the previous leaf that I left, and then this is the growth point right there. So we got a few of these guys. Some of the leaf kind of just yellowed, and I pretty much just cut them off, like in this one. This one's not taking off. I don't see any roots. Let's see if you guys can see. But I do see a tiny growth point there. So if I remove this leaf right there, you guys can see there's a new growth point coming out of that node. So it just needs some roots, and from there it'll take off. I think this is a baby Cebu blue. I think I just threw a tiny cutting in there. Here's another Cebu blue as well. And yeah, all of these Stanleyana. This one is now a leaf that's unfurling. So you guys can see there's a growth point, the shot out of the node, and now this is a leaf. Oh, that's so exciting. Now in this box, we have our Philodendron verrucosum. So again, one of the cuttings already took off, and I potted them in their own little container. We got one here that I should probably transfer and move into another, own little pot. And then this is kind of the mother node or cutting that I used to really grow a lot of my verrucosum. Literally, I probably made like 4 or 6 verrucosum plants already that I sold at the shop out of my mother plant, and this is kind of the base. So I leave this in a prop box pretty much forever. I probably need a taller one because this is getting bigger. So what I'm typically going to do is probably just going to cut close to the base and then pot this in its own little container, similar to this. And because it is super tall, it's not going to fit here in the box. I'm going to use my bag or plant in a bag method, using that clear plastic bag that you can find at like your flower shop and whatnot. In my little Tupperware here, we got some marble queen pothos. So these are really easy. And this is what I mean when you're, I guess you're cutting. See, it already rooted, but those ends there kind of is rotting. The fact that it rooted is still gonna survive. We just don't need this piece anymore. And then over here are some Aglonema pictum tricolor. So these were all canes and pretty much no leaves at all, no roots. And I'm happy to see that we have a few that is starting to show some leaves now. So that's really exciting. And then we have my other Tupperware here. These were all wet sticks. So wet sticks are pretty much, there is nothing, no leaves, no roots, nothing. This is what wet stick, and it's still a wet stick. But we got a few of our jade satin syndapsis that has roots and that shot a leaf. So that's really exciting. These actually surprisingly took really long. Like, I think out of all of this, the fastest one that took off is the Siltepecana, the Verrucosum, obviously the Pothos Acebulu, and then Stanleyana. But syndapsis, I find they take forever to root and grow new leaves, especially coming out of a wet stick. I think this is an Exotica. So that was a quick tour of the different type of cuttings that's currently growing in my prop box, and I'm excited to see a lot of them doing really well, especially the Monstera Siltepecana. The Stanleyana, surprisingly is growing a lot slower than I had thought, because as a plant, that thing took off for me. But nonetheless, they are all showing signs, so that's always a good thing. And hopefully you guys found this video helpful and informative in order for you to make your own prop box using sphagnum moss. Comment and let me know what type of cuttings you plan on propagating in a prop box, and if you have any other questions when it comes to making your own propagation box. Other than that, hopefully you enjoyed this video, enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see you guys soon. Peace.